I am joined today by two great guests. Our featured author is Chris Crutcher. Chris's first novel, Running Loose, was published in 1983 and then by 1984 made USA Today's top 10 banned books list. And he is proud to report that nearly all of his subsequent works have been censored and or banned somewhere in the great US of A, and that those bannings have earned him 2 Lifetime Achievement Intellectual Freedom Awards, one from the National Council of Teachers of English and the other from the National Coalition Against Censorship. More than 10 years as a teacher, then director of a K-12 alternative school in Oakland, California, followed by 20-odd years as a child and family therapist working with abuse and neglect families while simultaneously acting as a chairperson for his region's child protection team, has informed his work as a novelist, short story, and nonfiction author. In the midst of all of that heartbreak and unforgivable neglect and violence, new heroes arose, compelling Crutcher to fashion his stories around them. Chris will be joined in conversation by award-winning local author Stacey Horan. Prior to becoming a writer, Stacey was a corporate lawyer and used writing as a creative outlet. Eventually, she became a full-time writer of young adult books. Her first book, Sycamore Lane, was published in 2014. After experiencing book festivals and author discussions, she was inspired to start her podcast, The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, which is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. As of today, Stacey has released 158 episodes of her podcast. So, wow, Chris, you're in great hands. And Stacey, I will turn it over to you, but I will spotlight you guys first. So let's see. All right, spotlight and add spotlight. All right, so I'm for reals handing it over now.
Okay. So Chris, I think we should probably start, assuming everybody on here has probably read at least one of your books, but for those that have not had the pleasure, let's talk about the kinds of books you write. Your latest out is Loser's Bracket, for anybody who's looking for the most recent. But you have a lot of books and a couple collections of short stories. Maybe describe for us the kind of books you write, because I think we need to know that before we start talking about why they've been banned so much.
Right. Most of the books, the protagonist in the book and books, and for the most part, the narrator's male. Loser's Bracket has a female. Loser's Bracket has a female narrator. In most cases, the narrator is and protagonist is, 17 or 18 years old, kind of right at the edge of stepping out into the world. And one of the reasons I write stories like that is, number one, I remember my high school days and my early college days like they were yesterday. I probably remember them better than I remember what I had for breakfast. And I grew up in a really small town, and in Idaho, a lumber town, loggers and mill workers and ranchers and a lot of tough guys, all of them tougher than I was. And number one, I didn't realize what kind of bigotry I was growing up in. I mean, it was, I probably didn't see an African-American human being in the flesh until I was 11 years old, but I heard the N-word every day. And when you grow up in that, you don't know what you're growing up in until you get a little ways away from it. And the arc of my life was, first off, going to college in the 60s when the Vietnam War and the protests for the war were going full blast, and the Freedom Riders were headed for the South. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed when I was a junior in college. Malcolm X at the same time. John Kennedy was killed when I was a senior in high school. So a lot of what was going on in the world was kind of similar to today, and frighteningly similar to today in terms of unrest and division. And my learning curve was steep. And my first job out of college it was real hard to get a teacher job because I'm the front end of the baby boomers. And there were a whole bunch of us, children of the guys who just came back from the war. And so there were a lot of us, and any job you applied for, there were probably 25 other people applying, and most of them were better qualified than I. But I went down to the Bay Area in California, and there were you didn't see it too much then, but there were alternative schools all over the place. And they were real loosely put together. And they were basically, your kid would get in trouble, and it would be, do you want to go to reform school, which is juvie, or do you want to go to Lakeside School? And they'd say, well, I'll try Lakeside for a while. And I was a teacher there for a short period. It was a K through 12 place, but my focus was more in middle and high school. And I just started changing my idea of what a hero is. I mean, there were kids that were surviving things that were beyond my imagination growing up. And I did that for about 10 years. And I hadn't written any stories yet, but I really wanted to. And I started realizing kind of in the middle of that time that I was just in a hotbed of story, and I was in a hotbed of character. And all of a sudden, I was seeing people stand up under pressure that would have crushed me when I was growing up. And I had this amazing ringside seat to it. So I did that for about 10 years. And then I moved back up to the Northwest where I live now. And I'd been a psychology and sociology major in high school. And they were starting some really, really intensive wraparound programs, therapy for child abuse and neglect families. And because I had worked with a lot of tough kids, and because I'd worked with a lot of tough parents, I was offered a job to work at the mental health center. And so I did about 20 years. And then I started really seeing a whole different set of heroics, because I was seeing kids that were still in the middle. I mean, they had been taken away from their homes, and they were doing everything they could do to get back. And it was really hard to get there. And sometimes their parents were supportive, and sometimes they weren't. And I was also working with the parents. So I was starting to see what life was like under fire, kind of from all sides. And one of the things, and I'd written one book, as I was leaving the Bay Area, I wrote Running Loose, and that was the one that came out in '82. Everything after that was informed in one way or another by the work I was doing. Now, you can't take a story out of a therapy session and stick it in a book unless you have a really good lawyer and no ethics. But you hear one story, 5 stories, 50 stories, and the truth, the similarity starts to float. And you would put those situations that were like that into your fictional characters' lives, and then let the story run. And that probably is the reason that so many of my stories were challenged or banned, or both. Because number one, I told those stories in the language that I heard them. And it wasn't too unfamiliar to me, because I grew up in a logging town, and I had 10 years in an alternative school. And the nicest thing they called me was Chris. and I say, I started to see these, the brilliance of survival. And one of the things I noticed about the brilliance of survival was, a lot of times it doesn't sell real well in school. My survival skills are not going to make me the teacher's pet. And so the struggle, the conflicts that came out in the world for these kids, and the struggles that came, conflicts at home, and at the same time, Spokane, where I live, and where I was working, is in eastern Washington, very near the Idaho Panhandle. And Idaho, even then and still, is really famous for its bigotry. I mean, I grew up there. I just call Idaho Arkansas with no accent, because there was some really, really ugly stuff that came out. And there was a neo-Nazi white supremacist fort about 40 miles from here. And these neo-Nazi kids came from all over the country in the summertime, and they had live ammo war games, and they had a newspaper out that was just bigoted against anybody that wasn't white. And they had done some serious, serious crime. And I had connections to some of those people, because they weren't very nice to their kids either. So I had some of those people in therapy. And one of the things that really informed my writing was that I had to back up so far to listen to those people's histories, to try to find some way that they could be decent enough to get their kids back, or figure out that they couldn't. And those were the things that got into my stories. Well, boy, I mean, some of those really harsh things that went on in families, a lot of people, particularly parents, and in those days, mostly the right wing political and Christian factions didn't want kids reading about that. And I'm on the other side thinking, I would be a, I would have been a lot better human being a lot earlier if somebody had given me those stories. And that became kind of I mean, it's the story first, but telling the truth about that kind of survival became the, you know, that was kind of that was the thing that kind of informed everything that I wrote.
Yeah. So have you discovered that have the arguments for banning or censoring your books been the same over the years, or have you noticed changes or trends? Have the arguments against them changed?
I really have noticed a change, and it really bothers me because it's worse now than it was back then. Back then, I felt really comfortable making the case for the stuff I was writing, and I was always very clear that I would say, if you're a parent of a kid that you think shouldn't be reading my story, don't have them read my story. If they're uncomfortable with it or you're uncomfortable with it, that back cover, that's like the knob on your TV. You can turn it off and go get something you want to read. But you don't have the right to tell other people's kids what they can read. So that was it, and that was an easy argument. Plus the fact that I mean, I used to censor myself. There were things I didn't write that I knew about, and then and I had, I'd grown up in the '60s. By the time the '60s and early '70s were over, it was like a sin to ban a book. That was what the free speech movement and all that stuff was about. But in the '80s, it came back, and that was it. And basically, it was a lot of the right wing of any kind being brought into politics. So if the conservative religion, things like that, were being brought into politics. So I just say, I can write only what I'm interested in, and it'll land where it lands. And then, and this is a little more recent, the politically correct left started chiming in on what kids should read and what they shouldn't, and it was about gender stuff, racial stuff, sexual orientation stuff, all of those things. And it got to the place where there were a couple of cases where somebody had written a story about that happened in Mexico, or that happened in somewhere else, about somebody of a different ethnicity, and you get killed on Twitter just for not being that ethnicity, or you'd get killed on Twitter for any of the gender stuff, all of those things. And it got to a place where and you've probably experienced this, where my editors were asking if I wanted to get a reader to go through and see if I offended anybody, and I thought, why wouldn't I offend people? I've been offending people all my life. What are you talking about? But it bothered me that there was that people, for some reason, people weren't willing to just celebrate a good story. Now I've had this conversation with Walter Dean Myers. I've had it with Christopher Paul Curtis, with Jackie Woodson, with a whole bunch of people about what I can write and what I can't write. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. Walter Dean Myers dropped out of school when he was 17 years old, lied about his age, and went to Vietnam. And he came back and wrote Fallen Angels. I could not have written Fallen Angels. And if I had written Fallen Angels, it would look like Chris Crutcher doesn't have any idea what he's talking about. So I understand that, and I accept any criticism if I blew it. But the idea that we have to be, that the political correctness just supersedes a good story, puts handcuffs on some pretty good writers. And then all of a sudden, correct science fiction, good science fiction is going to get knocked because science is being treated the way it's being treated in education, and social studies, history, all of those things, and pretty soon people. I mean, they have, and I know you know this too. There are lists in Texas of like 500 books they don't want you to read. None of those people read 500 books. They all get together and decide, oh, there's a gay kid in this book, or there's a trans kid in this book, or those things. So it scares me now because there's a certain faction, and it's not the whole country, but it's a certain faction that wants you to. They want you to think about all of those politically correct things before you tell your story, and I'd never get past chapter 2.
Right. And what's interesting is you're telling stories that are not untrue. I mean, your stories are based on real life experiences, real
Right.
people you have met, real conversations that you have had. So the stories you tell they're fictional, but they're not fiction.
Right.
So it's interesting that the argument is that people shouldn't read your stories, given that your stories happen and probably happen to a much worse extent in real life, like the things that you don't write about. Do you find yourself censoring or having that conversation in your head as you're thinking of story ideas or starting drafts, or are you willing to just say, it's a good story, I'm going to write it? Or is there a part of your conversation that says, am I willing to have this argument over and over with people that I should have been able to write this story?
Yeah, I don't do that, and the reason I don't do it is because it would completely paralyze me. And one of the things I heard really early on, and from good writers, was it's all about the story. And one of the best things that I heard at the time was nobody has to see your first draft. Get it out there and take a look at it. If you want to censor yourself, do it later. Or if you want to censor yourself, if there's some, if somebody, one of your readers or somebody at the publishing house or something picks something out that just is in error, we can fix it before it comes out. If I worry even a little bit about audience, my story just falls apart. And I'll tell you, frankly, when I wrote Loser's Bracket, and I'll never do this, I'm so surprised I did this, and I will never do it again. But somebody at the publishing house asked if I wanted a sensitivity reader for it. And I said, no, but if you do, be my guest. I'm not, you don't have to change anything. And she came back, and there was an adult, a real helping adult in the story, a man, an older man, and he was based on a good friend of mine, and he was African American. And the thing that came back was, does he have to be black? And I went through it, and I thought, he doesn't have to be. And the only time in my life I did this, I changed him. And the book is far worse for it. Because the minute I changed him, he wasn't my friend anymore.
Right.
And he didn't, I made him tough. I did all the things. I gave him the, the stuff that he would need to carry the story. But like I said, I did it. And when I read it, once it came out, I thought, man, you just learned a good lesson. I hope nobody buys this book.
It's a different story then. It's not the story.
It's not the story.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, because it didn't, this guy was such an interesting character, and his real life story arc was one that I was in love with. And the minute he wasn't that guy anymore, and he didn't look like my friend anymore, he just lost most of his mojo. It just, it was a huge mistake, and I should have been smart enough not to do it in the first place, because I don't, I didn't, I wasn't out to please anybody, but for some reason that there were all these warnings that, and I hadn't been paying attention. So I hadn't been paying attention to kind of the ebb and flow of young adult literature. So I thought, well, maybe somebody knows something I didn't know, but they didn't. And it'll never happen again.
Well, let's talk about your work in progress. So you're working on a book that will come out, and I understand you've been working on it for a while now.
Yeah, Loser's Bracket is almost historical fiction now. Since I do interviews and a lot of Zooms as proof of life. If you read a Chris Crutcher book, you're not reading another old dead white guy. But I'm actually, I have 3 books right now, and one of them is finished, but I wanted the book that I'm finishing right now to come out first.
Okay.
The first one is just it's really a lot more humorous book, and it's about a young guy who gets a scholarship to this elite summer writing program on the East Coast on the basis of a couple of essays and 2 short stories that his teacher and his mom got together and sent into this thing to give him a big surprise, and he was accepted to the program and everything. And so he's headed to this wonderful writer's workshop, but he didn't write the stories. His girlfriend wrote the stories. And I had flashbacks of my high school experiences the whole time I was writing that. But the book that I'm working on right now it's a nonfiction book that is about the people who worked their way into my fiction. And I have permission to tell the ones that were clients, I have permission to tell their stories. And so it's a composite. It's called Stotanic Verses, because I was hoping that people would think it was Salman Rushdie's book and buy a couple extra copies. But it's basically a book of essays that is kind of the life arc of some of these real life people that became characters, and then situations that I turned into plots. So it's this kind of combination of tragedy and comedy that is, the whole thing about being alive.
Right. I'm curious, of all the books that you've written, were there any that were, looking back at them now, or even the ones that are, I guess, your works in progress, are there any that you find were particularly difficult to write for whatever reason? It was just hard to physically get it down, or the subject matter was particularly challenging? Like, are there any that stick out for you that you would rank as difficult, hard?
Yeah, the hardest one for me was Chinese handcuffs. And the reason was I was still working full time as a therapist, and I had 2 clients, 2 16-year-old girls, both of whom had been molested within their families growing up. And neither had said anything about it till they were like almost 16 years old, and it blew up in their faces, and they lost. I mean, the family went against them. It was all of that crazy stuff. And one girl in particular, she was just brilliant. And she was like a straight A student and a fabulous athlete. And she had this, look at me here so you don't see me here. So I'd had her in therapy for about 7 or 8 months. And she was a voracious reader and had read a few of my books. And we were in a session one day, and she said, you got to write about this. And I said, I get it, but I'm not sure I get it. And she was really funny. She said, I don't think you heard me. She said, you got to write about this. And I said, I don't know that I could do it. I don't know that I get it right. And she said, if I'd read a book about this a long time ago, I would have told sooner. I didn't know anybody else in the world knew. So I I I I hesitated a little longer and kind of fought her off. And she said, look, she said, I'm a really good reader, right? I said, I know you're a really good reader. She said, that probably makes me a pretty good editor. So I'll read it chapter by chapter. I'll tell you if you screw up. I said, okay, but you can't be nice to me. And she said, when was I ever nice to you? So I sat down and one of the characters, one of the two main characters in the book was the girl who had gone through her kind of experience. And I didn't write her experience, but I wrote one that was much like it. And it took me about twice as long to write it because she was reading it and her friend was reading it and they were giving me notes. And I got finished with it and the book came out and it was my fourth book. And the first three, even though they'd been through the censorship stuff and everything, they'd gotten really good reviews. I was getting like 80% good reviews. I was feeling pretty good. This book was 50-50. I mean, the people who liked it loved it, and the people who didn't like it hated me. And I read some of the really nasty critiques of this book. And I thought, because I was still fairly new, and I thought, I wonder if I crossed some line that I didn't know was there between, coming out of fiction or out of real life into fiction. And I was down in Houston, Texas, and I was doing a week there, and the schools around Houston are huge. So I just finished talking to an auditorium full of kids, probably 900 or 1,000 kids. And we were talking afterwards and signing books and stuff. And there was a girl right behind me, and I saw her go back, and I could just feel her. And she was waiting, and she was going to wait till I was alone. And so finally the bell was about to ring, and she stepped up and said, I don't have any questions or anything, but when I read Chinese Handcuffs, I thought you knew me. So she started talking about it. She said, one of the things she said was, you're the first person I've ever told. And she wouldn't give me her name because she knew I was a mandatory reporter. But she talked a little bit about it. Bell was ringing, and she said, so like, what do I do now? You're a therapist, and I could be a client, but you live in Washington, I live in Texas. And kind of out of desperation, I said, who gave you the book? And she said, my English teacher. And I said, did she give it to everybody, or did she just give it to you? And she said, I think she just gave it to me. I said, I'd go with my English teacher. And this was back before email, but she was a senior in high school. She was 17 years old. She was getting ready to graduate. And in like August or something, within a week, I get a letter from a teacher and a letter from her. And I hadn't even met the teacher. And she said, she was 18. She didn't have to worry about child protection services or anything. They'd gone for help. And it took away any question I had about, number one, about the value of the book, because I didn't care if anybody read it but her. Right. Because I felt like this kind of conduit between her and this kid that I had been working with in Spokane, and that it solidified for me that it was okay for me to write about anything that I know about. I still knew that there were things I couldn't write, but that was the end of it of me worrying about subject matter.
Right, and it shows you the value of a story like that.
Yeah. And the number of letters and emails about that saying exactly the same thing. I thought I was alone until I read something that was so similar. And it's even kids. The thing about writing stories about tough kids and kids that have been under fire is that at one level or another, every kid feels that way at some point. We all have felt like outsiders. We all have felt like we weren't heard. I don't care. The best football player in the school has had times when he felt like that nobody understood. Right. And it's more about that response, that kind of familiarity that you can find with with any given character.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you go to a conference with more authors than one, and one of them is Laurie Hall Sanderson, you will never get to eat, because if you go to eat with Laurie, there will be at least 15 young women or teachers who stop in tears to say, "I didn't even know it was rape until I read Speak." And Laurie will stand there and hug them till all the tears are dry, and you're starving to death. But
Right.
and that's, that is just the nature of, and a lot of stuff that she writes, and that, I mean, God, look at Jason Reynolds. I mean, the guy he's a missile, and writing, writing truths that the kids really, really connect to.
Right. Right. Well, let's talk about characters that people have connected with. Have there been any characters that you've written that you've been surprised by when you've read the reviews or the responses from your readers? Either because people connected with a character you didn't necessarily expect them to, or ones that you thought people would connect to and for some reason they didn't like. Have you been surprised by anything?
I have been surprised. At one point, my second book, which was Stoughton, it was about a high school swimming team. And one of the characters in the story was this little kind of dweeby guy. He was a really good swimmer, but he lived in an abusive home, and his name was Nordy Wheeler, and I had him. There are four kind of main characters in the story, and Nordy is the one that just everybody else is kind of propping up, and he kind of lives in the eye of the hurricane, but he's, like I said, he's kind of a dweeby kid. I mean, he's funny, but he's funny at, mostly because he's got this innocence. And I really liked him when I wrote him. And the kids on the swimming team were like guys that I swam with when I was in college. And not long after the book came out, Mike Prince called me, and he was of Prince fame, Prince Award fame, called me up. He was still in Topeka, Kansas, and he was asking me to come and do a writer's workshop in Topeka West. But he said Nordy Wheeler is the best young adult character I've ever read. And I thought, he's not even the hero. Mike, come on. How about Walker? But it was this. Mike was one of those guys that just connected with. He was the librarian at Topeka West, and he connected with every kid who was broken. I mean, he could spot them coming into the library, and so Nordy was, those kids.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think he single-handedly sold Stoughton. So that was a character that resonated. I was writing a lot from a male point of view, just because that's my point of view, and I felt more comfortable with it. But I had always used, and I still do always use, really strong female characters, because, in my experience, girls are just smarter than boys, just across the board. I'm sorry, but the girl will be able to articulate what's happening and what a jerk you are better than you will be able to do. And there were some times when I would get feedback saying, that girl was too tough to be exciting, or too tough to be hot, and you're going, no, not at all. And at the time, I mean, a lot of that stuff, I mean, it was right before, right around, a little before and around Title IX. And so, girls you weren't getting the really good athletes. You weren't seeing them the way we see them today. And we still don't see them like they should be. But there was kind of a male backlash to it. But when I get that kind of backlash, I just make the next girl tougher. And part of that, again, if I talk about taking characters from places that people I've seen and all that, but you never get very far. I never get very far away from myself. And I grew up I grew up in a family where if you had a male voice, it just was heard, and if you had a female voice, it wasn't. And that's my mom and my sister. And my dad was a World War II bomber pilot, and he was the king in his castle. And he wasn't malicious about that or anything else, but he had a belief system that just stepped in front of things, and particularly stepped in front of women and girls. He was a much better dad to me than he was my sister, because he didn't know how to parent her, and that was happening everywhere. And when I got to college, I mean, it's the 60s, and all of a sudden, women are not taking that crap anymore, and girls are not taking that crap anymore. And boy, you want to talk about a steep learning curve. It was plenty steep for me, and probably saved my life as far as relationship goes, because all of a sudden people were, girls and women were able to say exactly what they had in mind, just like men had been able to do, and they'd knock you down. And they were, like I said, they were always smarter.
Well, as a girl, I like hearing that. Thank you.
I'll tell you what, as soon as we have a majority of women running the country, we might make it. So if this writing thing, if you get tired of it, run for office.
So before we slide into questions from the audience, I want to do two things. One, I want to make sure we let everybody know where they can find you if they're looking for updates on new releases, things you have going on, just learn stuff about you. Where can they go to find that information?
Well, they can always find me on Facebook saying things that offend a whole bunch of people.
Okay.
All the world and I have a website that's chriscrutcher.com. I don't keep it up very well because I don't know how. I used to have a web page person,
Mhm.
so some of it is a little off. But actually, if you want, the best thing to do is just email me. I'm at Stoughton717 at Gmail, and the 717 is my birthday, just in case anybody wants to send
And
me.
that was the second thing, is happy birthday coming
Oh,
up.
thank you. God, nobody ever expected me to live to be 76.
No, that's not true. Well, and hopefully you'll
my
be
parents were thinking early 20s. That boy's not going to make it.
All right, well, thank you for the great conversation, Chris and Stacey. And as you mentioned, Stacey, we're going to open it up now to questions from our audience on Zoom. So please type your questions in the chat and Stacey will read them to Chris.
All right. Now I have to find them. There we are. Okay. So while we're waiting for them to come through, I do want to ask maybe a couple other questions. So I'm curious, were you a big reader as a kid? And are you a big reader now?
I'm a real big reader now. We didn't have the designation when I was a kid, but I was ADHD squared. And if a book wasn't stunningly interesting, I just couldn't keep my head in there. My mind bounced all the time. I was a horrible student in that regard, because I'd walk into the classroom and I'd give you, like, I don't know, 45 seconds to a minute and a half to get my attention. And then I could look right at you, but my mind was down the road. And it was real hard for me to concentrate. I had a horrible time studying. I just thought I wasn't very smart because I didn't realize how my mind worked. But I love story. I love television. I love movies. And when I was a sophomore in high school, I had an English teacher who was a really good teacher, but she just was in love with, books by old dead white guys, long dead white guys who spoke a real different language than I did. And I just couldn't, I cheated like a riverboat gambler. I found my brother's old book reports and I recycled like a madman. And then I read To Kill a Mockingbird. And there was the voice. I mean, Scout was like my friend. She would tell me things. She'd tell me everything. And I mean, it was almost as if she was saying, I won't tell anyone else, but I will tell you, and then you look on the back and she sold 7 jillion copies. So you knew she was cheating on you. But while you're reading the book, it's just, there was a connection that felt like it was intimate. And it got me by the time when I was in college, I was doing a lot of psychology and sociology. So I was reading a lot of textbooks. But I had friends and a lot of guys that I swam with and my college girlfriend were real big readers, and they used to like taunt me. And so when I got out and I had a chance to start reading, I started reading Kurt Vonnegut, and start reading books that just I loved comedy, I loved people who could say the most amazing things in the fewest words, like Vonnegut and Joseph Heller, and then so I started reading like crazy. And then I realized, I mean, I probably, had I read it earlier, I probably would have started writing much, much earlier. But I had to read books the best teachers are other writers, the stories you fall in love with.
Right.
So I read all the time now.
We've got a couple questions here, and we'll sort of take them in turn, but I want to talk about a little bit. Somebody has asked about your writing process, and I know you have said you were questioning whether you have a writing process. But I guess, how do you get the idea on the page?
Number one, I've learned to just jump in the middle. I mean,
Okay.
it's like something will happen. I wrote an adult kind of a thriller back in the 90s called The Deep End. And I was I was reading in the newspaper one morning that there was a 6-year-old girl who had been kidnapped, was missing. And I kind of knew her family, and she had a little 4-year-old brother. And the 4-year-old brother, it turned out later, after he'd been in therapy, in play therapy, actually with the woman who's my partner, he disclosed that he had seen her stolen. And bingo, here's a 4-year-old kid who saw his sister get kidnapped, and was told that if he told anybody, the kidnapper would come back and get him. And then down the road, he had to go to court as a 5-year-old and testify against this guy who's sitting right over there. And I thought, boy, that is the heart and soul of story. Now I can dress that up any way I want to. I'm taking it out of the newspaper. But at that point, then, in the beginning for me, it's the real thing. But it's not going to be the real thing for very long. I get 2 chapters into it, and it's a different kid. I mean, that your character takes over. And then I follow a kind of a path that Robert Cormier taught me. I mean, he basically said, the mantra of a fiction writer is, what if, what if, what if? And the answer to what if is your story. And so when I would get to that place where people talk about getting writer's block or whatever it is, I would start doing what ifs. And the answer to some of them was stupid, but you'd hit the one. Right. And it would, and then a little ways in, it's almost as if your narrator is telling you the story and you're writing it down for him. I mean, that's the magic. That's the fun of it.
Right.
And then I go from, it's one chapter at a time. And then for me, I don't know the ending when I start. So I'll be about 8 chapters in, and I think, I know where this goes. And at that point, everything becomes easier. I have to go back and do a lot of editing on those first 8 chapters because I've taken some wrong turns. But at that point, then you go back to the old, I think it's a Kurt Vonnegut statement about if it doesn't push the story or enhance the character, dump it. Mm-hmm. And so then all of a sudden the story starts to, you get a structure. Yeah. And I know people who can outline it from beginning to end, and I'm horribly jealous of that. But for me, it's because one of the things about having that kind of bouncy brain that I have is that I'll be writing and then something will happen in my real life, and I'll go, "Whoa, that belongs in the story," and it'll take a a side road.
When you get to that point where you think, oh, I know where this is going, I think I know the ending. Have you ever gotten to the end and it's turned out to be different? Like, have you ever gotten close to the end and been like, oh, I didn't realize that's what was going to happen, or how that's going to wrap up?
That really worked. That really happened with Whale Talk, and it was I had this. I mean, it was probably it encompassed probably more issues and things like that than some of my other books. And I was using that that white supremacist camp over there, the neo-Nazi camp, as part of the plot, and there was a mixed race kid was my narrator, and I got to the end of the story, and it was kind of a nice, sweet, tight, happy ending. But this kid had been kind of in the middle of he was being blamed by the antagonist in the book for having messed with his family, and the guy was a racist anyway, and so it was one of those things where there was real destructive anger on the part of the antagonist. And it was right about the time there was a standoff over in northern Idaho at the time. It's called Ruby Ridge. It's an easy one to Google. But there's a white supremacist. He used to be a deputy in one of the counties over there, and he was gathering weapons and things like that. And he was up in the hills, and the FBI and the ATF went in to get his guns, and it ended up in a shootout. I think his wife was killed. It was really nasty. And there was a guy from Arkansas who had heard about it, and he took a bus all the way to Spokane, and then he was going to take this other kind of a shuttle bus up to close to Ruby Ridge. And he was walking through the bus station here in Spokane, and there was a mixed race couple walking through, going to another bus, and he shot him just to stand with this Ruby Ridge guy. And I thought, that's how nasty it gets, and we're still in that spot. So in the end, I changed the ending, and it was, I mean, I kept the ending that I had, but I went 2 more chapters. I thought, this guy, he is way too far over the edge to just let this story ride. And so that particular one, like, that jarred me at the end. And it was a really good ending, and it just bothers the hell out of people, which makes it even a better ending.
Right. So we have another question. And this one is, I'm going to change it a little bit. The question is, how do you get published, especially today with a lot of people self-publishing and Amazon being big, and there's a lot of options for publishing these days. I'm curious, how did you get your first book published, and does the process for getting your books published today differ from what it was like way back when?
It really does, and I think it was easier for me because, number one, there were a lot more small publishing houses, and in most of those, and I was published by William Morrow, who ended up being bought up by HarperCollins, so that's my publisher now. But the process then, if your book went into a senior editor at any of these houses, they could make that decision by themselves. And so I was lucky I had a friend who was a writer and had an agent, and she had gotten one of his books published, and it was about a high school wrestler, and so it was kind of along the same lines as Running Loose, and he kind of gave me the introduction, and so I got it to the agent, and she had just been through all the places she needed to go to get his book published, and got it to my editor, And she made the decision like that. That was it. It didn't have to go in front of a committee. Nobody was talking about, well, we already have a book like that. Da, 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 you know, we already have a more well-known author has written a book like that. We don't want. There are all of these considerations that I think happen now that I hear from newer writers that I didn't have to go through. And then once I was published, and I was lucky because it was I don't know that I could have, this whole thing about have a thick skin, you're going to get a lot of rejections. I'm not big on rejection, and I don't know that I don't know that I would have had the the wherewithal to just keep pushing it. It's changed now because a lot of books do go, new books in particularly, do go before a committee. And it's always smart to look and find out which agents represent which kind of books and who's publishing newer authors and who's publishing in a particular genre, all of those things. I mean, there's, I think, more research that needs to go. We had The Writer's Market was the one book that we all, went to look at to see. Now you can find it all on the internet. But then it's this question of, who can represent me, who's gonna market for me, all of those things, because you can self-publish, but it's real hard unless you're really clever. It's real hard to, it's really hard to get traction so that people know. But the other part about it is a really good story is going to get published. It's going to land. You do need to have a thick skin, because you might send a really good story into somebody who's having a bad day. It's like we have to remember that the readers and the editors, they're just human beings, and there's and this. I mean, there have to a lot of kind of random things have to fall together.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do want to ask, since you've had a rather long writing journey to get to here.
Yes.
What has been the best part of it for you?
Well, I think the best part for me is I've been in every state in the union a number of times in probably 13 or 14 foreign countries at American international schools. So I've traveled in a way that I never would have been able to travel. And when I stopped doing therapy full time because I was gone so much and you couldn't schedule it, and I was doing mostly consulting, it was really helpful to hang out with kids. I mean, to hang out with the people that I was writing about, because evolution doesn't happen real fast, so we're all a lot the same, but times change really fast. And so the pandemic, for crying out loud, kids' response to that, I wouldn't know about that unless I was Zooming with classes and doing all those kind of things. And I wouldn't know. One of the things that I think is true, particularly for teenagers, middle schoolers and teenagers, is they have a tremendous amount more information to deal with than I ever had. I mean, I used to get the news at the movie theater on Friday night. The world could end on Wednesday, and I wouldn't know until Friday, and so it was all real slow, and things have sped up. I mean, I didn't know where I was going to go to college until the last semester of my senior year, and I didn't worry about it. In fact, I thought you were just supposed to show up. I didn't know you had to apply.
Well, thank you very much. That was such a fun talk. So I want to thank everybody for coming to our Teen Lit Chat today. And of course, especially thank you to Chris and Stacy. And I hope that you all had a great time.